It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this course on inferential discrete mathematics for second semester BCA program. In the last lecture we had an introduction to this theory of inference, where we used various rules of inference to arrive at a conclusion based on a few given statements. Today we'll take it forward and understand how to apply the same rules of inference when the statements are covering a larger domain. We start with the idea of a quantifier. We'll look at statements which cover not only a single object but more than one objects. For example, have a look at the sentence on your screens now. It says every computer connected to the university network is functioning properly. Now, a particular university may have more than 100 computers in its network, and we have to convey their functional status using a single statement. Writing individual statements for every computer in the network will make this task tedious. We might have to write down separate statements for all the hundreds or thousands of computers in a particular network. But with this idea of a quantifier, we can express the same statement logically if we can somehow quantify this idea of a computer in a given network. This is where we will learn the first quantifier, known as the universal quantifier. The formal definition of the same is on your screens. The notation for all x, we'll have a look at the first notation here. For all x, it looks like an inverted a in the uppercase, will represent the universal quantifier. It is described as follows. The notation for all x p of x denotes the universal quantification of a statement p of x. Here the symbol, this is where we introduce the first quantifier called the universal quantifier. We denote this universal quantifier by this symbol called for all. It looks like an inverted a in the uppercase, and this is what we use to denote the universal quantifier. The formal definition of the quantifier and the symbol goes on like this. The notation for all x p of x denotes the universal quantification of the statement p of x. Here this symbol is called the universal quantifier. This is read while arguing as follows. We read for all x p of x as for all x p of x, for every x that p of x is being denoted. An element for which p of x is false is called as a counter example of p of x. We also have another kind of quantifying option available. We call this as the existential quantification. This is read as follows. When you have the symbol there exists an x, you read it as follows. There is some element x in the domain such that the statement p of x is observed. We use the notation for the existential quantification of p of x. This is also expressed in other ways as follows. The same phrase called there exists can also be replaced by the following phrases: for some, or for at least one, or there is. Each of them is being denoted by the same quantifier there exists. It looks like a reflected e in the uppercase. Now we'll have one small example describing the two quantifiers here. Let n of x denote the statement that a computer, say x, is connected to the university network, and let us include all computers in the network as the domain for the problem. Then the symbol there exists n of x will represent the statement that every computer on the campus is connected to the network. You see, this is a universal quantifier. This talks about every single computer in the network of the campus. So that's why we use for all x. Similarly, we have one more example. We also have another example which talks about there exists an x such that n of x is true. This denotes a statement that there is at least one computer that is connected to the network. See, here we only talk about some computers or exactly one computer, but not all computers. That is why we do not use this quantifier which we saw above, and we use this existential quantifier. Let's have a few other examples as well. Whenever there are these quantifiers, they will follow some order of precedence, and the precedence is always in this form. When you have a disjunction, a couple of statements P and Q and another quantifier, the quantifier takes higher precedence over any other statement that is following. Therefore, when you have for all x, P of x and Q of x, this is preferred, and only then the disjunction is being operated. Next, we'll have a look at how to negate a given quantifier. We'll have a look at two examples. The first of them is this. Consider the statement where you say that every student in your class has taken a course in calculus. Since it says every, we use the universal quantifier and express it like this. For all x, P of x is true, where P of x denotes that a particular student has taken a course in calculus. Since this is observed across every student in the class, we represent this by this quantified form. How do we negate this? Let's understand this logically. Statement 1 says every student in this class has taken a course in calculus. Now the negation is the exact opposite. We're going to say it is not the case that every student in the class has taken a course in calculus. That is how you negate it. We have already seen this before. You just have to include the phrase it is not the case before the actual statement. Or this is also interpreted in another manner where you say that there is one student in the class who has not taken a course in calculus. That is the exact opposite, because the given statement said all students have taken a course in calculus. Therefore, its opposite must be not all students have taken a course in calculus, or you have at least one instance where some students or exactly one student has not taken the course in calculus. So this can be expressed logically by this quantified statement where you have there exists an x such that P of x is false. Can you understand the difference between the two? The given statement was for all x P of x. Its negated version, when you negate it, of course you will negate P of x, thereby introducing negated P of x, and you are also supposed to change the quantifier. What was there as a universal quantifier has now become an existential quantifier. This is how you negate an expression that is quantified. You will negate the statement and you will also reverse whatever quantifier that is available. A universal becomes an existential and an existential becomes a universal quantifier. So this is how it happens. The negated version of the given statement, which was for all x P of x is true, when you negate it, you will first choose the other quantifier, as in there exists and next you will also negate the given statement having the opposite of p of x. This is how you negate a statement that is already quantified. One more example, consider this. There is a student in the class who has taken a course in calculus. This can be expressed logically by this quantified statement, there exists an x such that p of x is true. Now we are trying to negate the statement. How do you negate this? We are looking at the negated version of there exists an x such that p of x is true. Now as we saw in the previous statement, we will have to negate the quantifier first. When you negate the quantifier, or when you have to go for the opposite of it. So an existential quantifier becomes a universal quantifier, and when you negate p of x, you just write p of x. So we are trying to convey the statement that it is not the case that there is a student in the class who has taken a course in calculus. This is equivalent to every student in this class has not taken calculus. This is how you negate the given statement. In other words, when you have a statement q of x which is quantified existentially in this manner and you are trying to negate it, you will first go for the other quantifier as in a universal quantifier and then go for the negated version of the given statement. So this is how we will be negating quantified statements. This chart on your screen will help you understand this better. A statement that is universally quantified is said to be true if it is true for all x, and it is said to be false even if there is one value of x for which it is false. And a statement that is existentially quantified is said to be true if there is even a single value of x for which it is true, and it is false when it is false for every value of x. And now let us have a look at their negated versions. The negation of an existentially quantified statement is first of all universally quantified, and then you negate the given statement. So what do you mean when you say you are negating an existentially quantified statement? Is that for every x there is some x for which it is true, that is what you mean, and when you negate it, it means that it is false for every x. Similarly, when you negate a universally quantified statement, you mean to say that it is true for some value of x. So this is how the tables will help you understand this idea behind negating statements which are already quantified. Let us have a look at some other examples of how to express common English statements using quantifiers. There are a couple of do's and don'ts here. Let us discuss them in detail. Look at the first sentence. It says that all lions are fierce. Here we are talking about an attribute of the animal called lion. So if you represent the animal lion with a variable x, then you are trying to say something which is true for all lions. Therefore it is a universally quantified statement. We are trying to say something about every lion that is available in the universe. Therefore it is a universally quantified statement, and hence you have the universally quantifier which is all for all x. So when you talk about an animal and you are including all animals, you use the universal quantifier for all x. Then you also talk about the animal being a lion. So if I say that p of x denotes the statement that the animal considered as a lion, then I'm trying to convey something about its character. I'm trying to convey that it is also fierce. So in other words, the first sentence is like a conditional statement. It says if X is a lion, then X is also fierce. And this happens to be true for every animal that is a lion. So to quantify this, we'll first use the universal quantifier, because we are talking about all animals that are lions, and hence this will be logically expressed as follows: for all X, if some animal is a lion, then the animal is also fierce, where Q of X is going to represent the fierceness of the animal. So here there are two attributes which are being considered: one where the animal is a lion, and two where the animal is also fierce. The statement makes a sweeping conclusion that if any animal is a lion, it is going to be fierce, or in other words, all lions are fierce. Therefore, this will represent the quantified statement which conveys the actual meaning given in sentence number 1. Let's go to sentence number 2. It says some lions do not drink coffee. Once again, here we are looking at two attributes here. An attribute where you talk about an animal being a lion and an animal drinking coffee. You are combining them both into a statement, but there is no conditional involved here. This may be true or may not be true for all lions. Therefore, the quantifier used in this case will be an existential quantifier, which says some lions do not drink coffee, where R of X denotes the fact that the animal X drinks coffee. So when you have an animal X drinking coffee, you have R of X, and the animal doesn't drink coffee, you have the negated R of X, and you have a common point between these two. There are animals which do not drink coffee, and there are animals which are lions. Therefore, this existential quantifier will convey the required meaning. The last sentence, some fierce creatures do not drink coffee. You are looking at fierceness. We earlier represented fierceness using Q of X, and we are also talking about the creatures having coffee. Therefore, we talk about the statement R of X, and it says some fierce creatures do not drink coffee. Now, since we have some, it is not a universal quantifier, we are referring to an existential quantifier. Therefore, you will have the last statement expressed as follows: there exists some X which is fierce and which also does not have the habit of drinking coffee. Therefore, there is a conjunction between an animal being fierce and an animal not drinking coffee. And since it is not applicable for all animals, we have an existential quantifier in there exists. So now we have seen how statements can be quantified and also expressed logically at the same time. So the next exercise will be to do the same, but also apply the rules of inference theory which you have already learnt to arrive at certain conclusions. We'll have a look at this set of statements, where statement 1 says a student of a class, say Doug, knows how to write a program in Java. It's a very flat statement, there are no conditionals involved, it just tells that someone knows how to write a program in Java. The second statement, it says everyone who knows how to write programs in Java can get a high paying job. So this connects two separate entities. It says the aspect of knowing how to write a program in Java can lead to a conclusion wherein the person secures a high paying job. There are two things, so we'll have to use different statements. So these two are the premises for the given problem, and we're supposed to arrive at a conclusion where you say someone in the class can get a high paying job. How to make sense of all the first two statements leading to the conclusion in the last? Let's see. Let's denote X by a student in the class. And let J of X represent the fact that the student knows how to write, a Java program. And let H of X denote the statement that the student gets or secures a high paying job. So look at the second statement now. The second statement clearly mentions something in common between knowing how to write a Java program and getting a high paying job. It says every student who knows how to write the program can get a high paying job. Therefore, the second statement is going to be a conditional which says if someone knows how to write a Java program, that person will get a high paying job. And this conclusion or this statement is common across all students. It says everyone. Therefore, you must have a universal quantifier in front of this conditional statement. It says every student who knows how to write a Java program can also get a high paying job. So it is a conditional, number one, and it is also universally quantified. Let's go to statement number one. Statement number one doesn't talk about everyone in the class. It says about a particular student called Doug. It says Doug knows how to write a program in Java. Therefore, what you have in statement number one is J of Doug, or J of D to be more precise. J of D. J of D. Now statement number 2 says for every x, J of X will imply H of X. Now since statement number 2, let's go to the conclusion in the next case. Since statement number 2 talks about every element in the universe, it is obviously true when X is Doug. Therefore, when you consider a particular case, you will know that it is true. So J of Doug will also imply H of Doug. It means if Doug knows how to write a Java program, Doug will get a high paying job. Now combine this with, this is statement number 2. Now combine this with statement number 1 which says J of Doug is true, or it means that Doug knows how to write a Java program. Statement 2 implies such a conclusion and statement 1 implies such a conclusion. Now there is a conditional involved, which means you can actually arrive at some other conclusion also. From yesterday's class, we know that we will use a rule called modus ponens, because you know that J of Doug is true. Doug knows how to write a Java program, and you also know that whenever Doug knows how to write a Java program, he will get a high paying job. Therefore, you can combine these two using the logic rule called modus ponens and arrive at the conclusion that H of Doug is true. It just simply means that Doug will get a high paying job, but this is only about Doug. It doesn't mean that every student in the class will get a high paying job. Every student in the class will get a high paying job only if he knows how to write a Java program. Now, since this information about Doug knowing how to write Java program is already given, this information also follows. But what are we trying to conclude? The last statement, look at the last statement again. We're trying to conclude that someone in this class can get a high paying job. We've actually confirmed that. We have got the information that Doug will get a high paying job. Therefore, we can quantify stating that there exists an x such that h of x is true. Because since h of Doug is true, this means that h of x is true when x is Doug. When the particular student that we are talking about is Doug, we know that h of x is true. Therefore, there is at least one value of x for which h of x is true. Since we say there exists at least one value, we have to quantify this using an existential quantifier. We cannot use a universal quantifier here because this is not true for all students. We do not know whether all students of the class know how to write a Java programming. Therefore, we have arrived at this rule. Since we know it for one x, we can make an existential generalization. This is what you call as an existential generalization. Since you know it to be true for one value, you can claim that there is at least one value for which the statement is true. We are not claiming across every student in the class, we are claiming only for a particular student. You are not claiming for the entire student. So it is not a universal generalization, it is an existential generalization, and this is how you do this. Let's have a look at the next statement. Somebody in this class enjoys whale watching. Now let's denote whale watching by W of x. So W of x means that x is a student of the class who enjoys whale watching. And statement number 1 says somebody. Therefore, there is an existential quantifier for which whale watching is true. Number 2, every person who enjoys whale watching cares about the ocean population. So it says every person, therefore should be a universal quantifier. It says, it compares two different attributes. It says if a person enjoys whale watching, he also cares about the ocean population. So for all x, for all students of the class, if whale watching is true, ocean pollution, caring about ocean pollution is also true. Let's denote caring about the ocean as C of x. So if a student worries, if a student enjoys whale watching, he also cares about the ocean population, ocean pollution. Therefore, and since this is true for every student of the class, then for all x, W of x is leading to the conclusion that C of x is true. Whenever someone enjoys whale watching, the same person is also going to care about ocean pollution. Statement 1, statement 2 and statement 3. Therefore, look at statement, can you conclude this now? Therefore, there is a person in the class who cares about ocean pollution. Can we use the first two statements to conclude the third one? Turns out to be yes. Because since the second statement is about the entire class or is about the entire set of people who enjoy whale watching, since it is true for all of x, it is definitely true for some of x. It is definitely true for some of x. That's what the second statement can be led to as a conclusion. There exists some X for which whale watching will lead to a conclusion that he cares about ocean pollution. Now you have a conditional and you have a statement which confirms the hypothesis. Therefore, once again you can use this rule called modus ponens and arrive at the required conclusion. By modus ponens you can see that there exists some X such that C of X is true, which means there exists some person who cares about the ocean population. We'll go to the next one. Each of the 93 students in this class owns a personal computer. So let's say P of X denotes the fact that X owns a personal computer. And since all of the 93 students are owning a personal computer, the first statement is universally quantified in this manner. The next one says, everyone who owns a personal computer can use a word processing program. So if someone owns a computer, then the same person can also use a word processing program. So for all X, owning a computer will lead to using a word processor. So whenever there is a person who owns a computer, he also knows how to use the word processor. But the conclusion we are supposed to arrive talks about a single person called ZK. It says, therefore ZK, a student of the class, can use a word processing program. It's not about every person in the class, it's about some person in the class. So how do you arrive at this conclusion? Let's write down what we have. We have one statement says for all X P of X is true. We have one other statement which says for all X, if P of X is true, the W of X is also true. Therefore by using modus ponens, you know that the hypothesis is true. Therefore for all X P of X in conjunction with the conditional will lead to the conclusion that for all X, W of X is also true. Therefore all students in the class, all the 93 students in the class know how to use a word processor. Then we are left with the required conclusion. The required conclusion talks about a particular student called ZK. It's not about every student, it's a particular student. Now this is where we use this rule called universal specification. Since it is true for every student in the class, it is true for some student in the class, namely X is ZK. Therefore, for all X, W of X is true will imply that W of ZK is also true. And hence, we have shown that the required conclusion can be arrived at. However, there are certain fallacies in the argument that people deliver. Whenever we use logic to arrive at conclusions, we also have to be sure that these fallacies are not provided as part of our argument. Let's have a look at two of the major fallacies which are generally committed by people who try to use logic. This first fallacy is called as affirming the conclusion. Consider the statement which says If the square of n is positive, then n is positive. Talk about squares, you know about squares. Let's say n is a positive number, let's say n is 3, then n square is 3. N square is 9. So we have a statement which says if n is positive, then n square is positive. This makes perfect sense. We saw an example. N is 3, 3 is positive, n square is 9, 9 is also positive. But can we use this to conclude this? Since the square of n is positive, can you write this statement? If n square is positive, can you conclude that n is also positive? Does it work always? Suppose I give you n square to be 9. Can you say that n is always greater than 0? You cannot, because the conclusion might have come also from n is equal to minus 3. When is negative 3, n square is 9. It's still positive. That doesn't mean that n is positive. Such an error is called as affirming the conclusion. So the original conditional statement that you have is P to Q, where you say if n is positive, then n square is positive. That doesn't mean the converse is true. You cannot say if n square is positive, then n is positive. Such an error is what you call a fallacy, and this fallacy is called as affirming the conclusion. Because you're trying to say that a statement and its converse, a conditional statement and its converse are true. Now you can recall that a conditional statement and its converse are not always true. A conditional statement and its contrapositive are the two statements that are true. Here we have a statement and its converse, and those two are never equivalent. If such an error is committed, you call that fallacy as affirming the conclusion. There is another error that is also possible. It's called as denying the hypothesis. Let's have a look at the same conditional again, which says if n is positive, then n square is positive, which is a true statement. It worked for 3. What if I conclude such? If n is not positive, then the square of n is not positive. Suppose I take a negative value, n is minus 2. Its square is 4, is actually positive. But can we make this kind of a conclusion? We cannot. That is why this error is called denying the hypothesis. It says if P then Q, that's the given conditional. But when you write it like this, you are trying to deny the hypothesis. You are trying to say if P is false, then so is Q. You are trying to say if n is not positive, then the square of n is also not positive. You are negating the entire conditional statement. If you can recall, you learned this as the inverse of a conditional statement, and we already learned a conditional and its inverse are never equivalent. I just told you that a conditional and its contrapositive are equivalent. So these two are never equivalent, and if such an argument is being supported, then that error is what you call as denying the hypothesis. We'll have a few examples where I've given you a mixture of statements which are either correct or have been supported using a fallacy. Let's see if we can identify all of them. Number 1 says all students in the class understand logic. So for all x, L of x is true. Xavier is a student in the class, so x is Xavier. Then can we conclude that Xavier understands logic? Yes. Since it is true for all x in the class, it is also true when x is Xavier. Therefore, L of Xavier is also true. Therefore, Xavier understands logic. So, a universal specification, a statement which was defined for the entire universe, can also be narrowed down to a particular element of the universe. It's true for everyone in the class, therefore it's true for one student, namely Xavier. So this did not have any fallacy, this is a proper argument. Let's have a look at one more example. Every computer science major takes a discrete mathematics course. It says for all x, a computer science major takes a course in discrete mathematics. C of x denotes a computer science major, D of x denotes discrete mathematics. So for all students, if that student is a computer science major, that student also takes up discrete mathematics. Now you know that Natasha is taking discrete mathematics. So this states that D of Natasha is true. For a particular value of x, you are trying to confirm the statement that that particular student has taken up discrete mathematics. Now can we use these two statements to conclude that Natasha is actually a computer major? Fine, let's try and see. Since we are dealing with particular examples, let's use the universal specification and consider the case where x is equal to Natasha. Therefore, C of Natasha will lead to the conclusion that D of Natasha is true. So if Natasha is a computer science major, Natasha will take up discrete mathematics. But what are we trying to imply? The conclusion says Natasha is a computer science major. We are not trying to conclude that she is a discrete mathematics student. We already know that from statement number 2. We are trying to imply that Natasha is a computer science major. This is a fallacy because you are trying to do something called the affirming of the conclusion error. So you know that there is a conditional C to D. Now you are trying to say D to C is also true. You know that D is right. The statement D is true when x is Natasha. And you are trying to say C of Natasha is also true. That is an error. These two are never equivalent. And this is what we precisely saw in the first fallacy that we discussed, called affirming the conclusion. And therefore, you have a fallacy here. This is called affirming, because you are trying to say a statement and its converse are equivalent. You know that this is not right, and hence it is a fallacy. For the last example of the day, let's have a look at this statement. All parrots like fruit. So let x be a bird and P of x denote the case where the bird is a parrot, and it says all parrots like fruit. So whenever P of x is true, f of x is also true, where the fruit, the bird liking the fruit, is denoted by f of x. The first statement is a conditional. For all x, if the bird is a parrot, then the bird likes fruit. Second statement says my pet bird is not a parrot. They are trying to show that P of x is false for the pet when x is a pet. So you are trying to negate P of the pet. Now with this, can I conclude that my pet bird does not like fruit? Can I say that negation of f of pet is also true. Will this work? Let's discuss this. Since we are considering exact values, let us use the value of x as pet. Now, my pet bird is not a parrot. That means we have negation of p of pet. That's right. And we are trying to conclude something about the bird liking the fruit. We are trying to imply that my pet bird does not like fruits. So, in a sense, we are trying to establish a conditional like this, or to be in particular, we are trying to establish a conditional like this. And if we discuss that, such a fallacy also cannot be permitted, because we know that p to f is true, and now we are saying negation of p will go to negation of f. This is what we saw as the fallacy called denying the hypothesis. If p is true, if p to q is true, the negation of p to negation of q is not its equivalent form, because this is only the inverse of the conditional and not the contrapositive. We have already learned that only a conditional and its contrapositive are equivalent. What we have in this case is a conditional and its inverse, so they cannot be the same. What we have at the bottom is the inverse of the conditional that we have on the top. They can never be equivalent, and hence such an argument cannot lead to this required conclusion. Therefore, this is the second kind of fallacy that we have learned, which is called denying the hypothesis. This is also a fallacy, and this cannot be used as an argument in favor of a particular conclusion in inference theory. So, in today's class, we have learned how to quantify certain logical statements. We have also extended that, and we have learned how to negate certain quantified logical statements. We have had a look at the equivalent forms of logical statements that are quantified and their negated forms as well. We have also discussed how to arrive at certain conclusions based on premises which are quantified logical statements. And towards the end, we have also discussed two major fallacies that are usually supported or provided as supporting arguments when conclusions are being arrived at. So, with this, we sum up the first unit in this course on inferential discrete mathematics. We have had a look at logic, we have had a look at the fundamentals of statements being true or false, we have had a look at the true false nature of statements, we have had a look at truth tables, we have had a look at conditionals, connectives, biconditionals and their equivalent forms. We have also had a look at the principal disjunctive normal form and the principal conjunctive normal forms of certain statements. We have also had an introduction to the theory of inference, which is being used to arrive at conclusions based on a specific set of rules. We have quantified these logical statements, and we have also used them to arrive at conclusions. Towards the end, we have also had a look at two incorrect forms of argument which we have called as fallacies. With this, we are at the end of the first unit. We will shortly follow up with another series of lectures where we will start from the second unit in this course of inferential discrete mathematics. Thank you.